introduction to the whole vCenter, vSphere. Sorry, I'm just trying to change this display screen. So we gave you a bit of an introduction to the whole vSphere scenarios. We covered a little bit of every aspect of the technology. Hopefully, give you a bit of an overview of what each part does. So from now on, we're going to go into each one a little bit more deeper, see how they apply, and we're going to start off with the vCenter server. Okay, so last week we started off with the ESXi. We said that was the hypervisor, that was the thing that does the work, that is the thing that's carrying the big load. Okay, whereas today we're going to look at the vCenter server, and you'll realize the vCenter server doesn't do any virtualization. What it does is it manages the virtualization infrastructure. It is the tool, the management server, that allows us to configure multiple ESXis together, okay, instead of dealing with them one at a time. So last week in your worksheet, you would have installed it, you would have used the web interface per ESXi server, and you would have managed it one by one. With the vCenter, at the end of this worksheet, at the end of the session, once you install, you have the vCenter application server running, you'll realize that once you log into one, you add the various ESXi to your cluster, and then you can manage each of them from there. Or you can create what's called enterprise-wide resources like distributed switches rather than individual switches. So, when we do the distributed switches, you'll realize that when we choose which ESXi servers are participating, which interfaces of those ESXi servers are being used, then the same configuration goes across all of the participating ESXi server. So today's objective is to understand the features and roles of the vCenter, to plan a vCenter server deployment, and to install and configure a vCenter server database, to install and configure vCenter server itself, and to use the vCenter management features. So we'll realize. So let's actually have a look at vCenter. So if you look at this diagram, probably the easiest way is just look at the diagram. vCenter is at the center. So what does it do? It manages the ESXi hosts. It allows us to manage the resources across all the hosts. Instead of talking about the amount of resources on ESXi1 or ESXi2, we can treat them like resource pools. And that's something we're going to look at later. We're going to be able to use templates. Remember, we talked about the idea of templates. We actually, if you guys have done your Cert 4 studies with me, you will remember we talked about the Golden Master quite a lot. The Golden Master is our example of a template. It's not a true template because it is a virtual machine that we make into a Golden Master. But in our studies in this subject, we will actually create a Golden Master, again, inside of the ESXi vSphere, but we're going to turn this virtual machine and convert it into a template. Okay, once it gets converted into a template, you can then not turn it on anymore. Okay, so remember when I told you guys in our Cert 4 that this Golden Master virtual machine, you can make all these clones, but don't turn it on because you might break it all. But once we actually do it here, we're going to turn it into a template, and at that point, then you cannot turn it on. You cannot start it. So going beyond that, again, none of these services is possible without vCenter. Again, with vCenter, we're going to take those templates. We're going to take those, individual, not just the individual virtual machines, but the individualization techniques. We're going to take these vCenter templates and deploy virtual machines. So if you're not sure about what I'm talking about, the individualization, remember, hi Roman, come on in, take a seat. I'm talking about how in the past, and so forth again, we did what's called sysprep, didn't we? We used sysprep on the clones so they can each have a different SID, they can each have a different computer name, different MAC address, all of those things. So you'll realize we don't have to do that onto the template anymore like we did in Cert 4. We can actually set up an individualized plan. And then we can actually use the template, deploy the virtual machines, and apply that individualization onto it. Again, we can use vCenter to manage the virtual machines. We can schedule tasks. We can look at the statistics and login, and we can set alarms and alerts to be triggered in case of various events. Example of that, it would be if you're running short on resources, low on memory, low on storage space. But all of these things require the vCenter. So the vCenter, as the name suggests, is the center of all of these features. Without vCenter, and you just use ESXi individually, you won't have all of these features. vCenter Server can be a Windows-based application or a virtualized application like what we're going to use. vCenter Server acts as a proxy that performs tasks on individual ESXi hosts, and that have been added as members of the vCenter Server installation. So centralized user authentication. Okay, so what that means is that instead of you having, you know how with ESXi we use the root and the password for that ESXi. If we had 10 different ESXi, it will be the root and the password for each one. If you change your password for one, it will not change for all the other 9. So a bit like the idea of the peer-to-peer network, if you remember back in the Cert 4. So what we're talking about here with the centralized administration authentication is without vCenter, you would need a separate user account for each of your ESXi servers to administer them. When you install vCenter on a Windows server-based OS, we can use the Active Directory database. So you'll see later on when we do one of the later worksheets, we'll be actually giving permissions to resources to be able to do things in the vSphere by using your Windows groups and accounts. And if you think about it, that's a big difference. So if you've got literally, let's say, 20 different users with different levels of access or types of users, then instead of actually creating individual accounts on each ESXi server, we can just plug into the same Active Directory that everything else is using, use the same groups, and then give them permissions in vSphere. vCenter Server provides the ability to perform vMotion, configure DRS, establish HA, and use FT. You're probably going, well, that's a lot of letters. If you remember last week, we talked about what vMotion was. vMotion is the ability to move or migrate virtual machines across from one host to another host without downtime, meaning the user don't detect an outage. We talked about how DRS, Distributed Resource Scheduler, allows us to use vMotion automatically to balance the loads across the ESXi servers. We talked about how high availability is the feature that allows us to detect an outage. If it's a host outage, OS outage, doesn't matter. We detect that virtual machine, that host is not available, and we take the virtual machines and start it up on a different host. So that was a little bit of downtime, but it's automatically can recover for you. And we talked about how fault tolerance is the idea of having a virtual machine, main one, and a secondary virtual machine running at the same time. Whatever happens to the main one happens on the secondary one. And if the main one dies for whatever reason, this one takes over. So if you remember, I'm referring to these acronyms now. So hopefully from now on, when I talk about these acronyms, you guys know what I'm talking about straight away without me having to explain each one again. I will when it's required, but obviously I don't want to explain that every time. Okay, so try to keep that in mind. So these features, the key word is these features that we just talked about. All the beautiful ones about keeping uptime for our services and servers is not possible without vCenter. If you go and get yourself 20 ESXi servers, no vCenter, you will not be able to do high availability, fault tolerance, vMotion, or DRS. All that is not available. It can only be done if you have vCenter. So really, without vCenter, your ESXi servers are probably just a tiny little bit better than your VMware workstation. The only reason why it's better is you don't need the underlying host operating system. You basically can use all the resources for the virtualization. Okay? So really, without vCenter, ESXi, VMware workstation, it's about the same. But with this vCenter, then all of these features come into play and makes ESXi or vSphere a lot better than a VMware workstation. Okay. Without vCenter server, you also lose key functionality such as vSphere distributed switches. So no distributed switches. Remember we talked about that as well. Be able to create a switch and determining which host is using that or part of that switch. And the same configuration goes across all the switches and can be used from any virtual machine that's on any of those hosts. And also we lose host profiles. So these host profiles we haven't talked about too much yet, but basically these host profiles allows us to determine what each host is like, and then it automates the startup of virtual machines so we can choose this host or that host without us thinking about it. We just have to press on the virtual machine, and the vCenter will find the right host to turn it on. We'll also lose profile-driven storage. Again, we can have different types of storage. Remember, we talked about this shared storage, but we could have different sorts of shared storage. Some which might be higher performing but higher cost. Some might be a little bit lower performing but cheaper. So with the profile-driven storage, again, we can automatically determine where we store the virtual machine's storage, like the virtual hard disk, the configuration files, and so forth. There's also vSphere Update Manager, or VUM. So I might refer to it as VUM in the future. Basically, what's that? That's you probably remember in Cert 4, you might have studied, did in Windows, you did the WSUS, the Windows Security Update Service. Remember that? Yeah, you do? You remember that, WSUS? Yeah, sort of. So that's where instead of our computers going to the internet to download all the updates from Microsoft, the WSUS is our server that downloads all the updates for all the different types of computers we have on our network, keeps it local, and if any of these computers want to get an update, they go to the WSUS server, and based on the rules we create, they will get the updates we say it's okay, or we don't get the updates, or we go through a process where we can thoroughly test it before we deploy it. And we can choose which computer is deployed and which computer is not. Think of that, but exactly the same with VUM. What does that mean? It's not for Windows, it's for the virtual machines. So this is talking about updates to ESXi, updates to VMware, updates to the virtual hardware, to the compatibility, and patches for those things. You will still have your WSUS for your Windows, Microsoft updates. You will still have your antivirus updates from wherever you do it, but this VUM is Update Manager for your infrastructure. Okay, so what can we do with the VUM? Again, we can create the rules. We can create what's called benchmarks. We can create rules where all hosts must have the automatically applied the critical updates. Okay, so if there's a new critical update that's released by VMware, the VUM will download it, keep it stored, and when these hosts runs their check every day, it will detect that there's new critical updates, and it will be automatically deployed onto the ESXi host based on those rules. This keyword extensible. Have you heard of this word before? What do you think the word extensible means? Because I can look around, pretty much everyone in here, including me, it's probably got English as not the first language. Do we know what extensible means? What's your understanding of extensible? Anyone want to guess? Let's a discussion.
Some sort of expandable?
Yes, expandable. What are you going to say?
The extent of how something can be used or utilized in this case.
I'm not sure what you mean, but
you know, because the extensible concept of you have the utility, you can extend it, and then also you can use it to a larger and further extent. E.g.,
yeah, I think you're on the right track now. So let's give you an easy analogy. You have a car. Okay, you drive your car, you carry your passengers, but a normal car, you can't have a caravan, can you? You can't have a trailer, can you? You can't tow a boat, can you? But you put a tow bar on the car, you make that car extensible. You can turn it into something that can tow a trailer, tow a car, tow a thing, add extra functionality to it. You get me? You add extra functionality. what this
Utilization,
yeah,
that's what I meant.
extending
That's what I meant.
extending what it can do. Okay.
That's what I meant. Sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay. Well, that's what we have a discussion. So we're all of the same understanding at the end of the day. It providing an extensible framework. All right. If you look at this was our original picture. Okay. Then what does that mean? It means that now we can add v Cloud Director. We can add this vSphere Update Manager that we spoke about. We can add the vCenter Site Recovery Manager. We add third-party APIs. So upon the basic features that we already had, we can add more functionality. That's what the extensible is. Okay, some of the functionality comes from VMware supplied products. Okay, like Update Manager, like Director, which is that automation thing. We got the site recovery, which is all about backups for your virtual machine. But the key one here is this bottom left, third-party APIs. Okay, we never heard of the term APIs, application program interfaces. Means if you're a programmer, let's say I'm from Symantec. Okay, I'm a third-party company. I'm not VMware. I'm not your company. I'm from Symantec. I've just created this new program that can do backups. Okay, I can backup backups. I can do backups, backup files like backup, and we sell you this hardware, this big giant server for backups. Now my backup software normally just backs up computers directly, right? But if through this API, maybe my program can interface with vCenter, then instead of actually backing up the computers directly, I can back up the virtual machines by going through the vCenter. You get what I'm saying? That's just an example, okay? I'm not saying Symantec makes that thing. I'm just saying because it's a third-party APIs, my program can interface with VMware's program to be able to do a function that wasn't there before. So that means you can do many things, possibilities. Choosing the right version of vCenter. Like I said, there's two options. We can install one on a Windows server. Okay, that's one option. That probably requires the most resources. Or we can use a Linux application, virtual application. And that's what we're going to use, a Linux virtual application. That has the smallest footprint. And obviously, that's why we're choosing it, because our resources are very limited already. So vSphere 5 and above comes with a Windows-based application or SUSE Linux-based virtual appliance. The Linux-based virtual appliance comes with preloaded additional services like auto deployment, dynamic host configuration, trivial file transport, and syslog. Obviously, you don't have to have DHCP turned on if you don't want to. Where is your expertise? So which one do I choose? Where's your expertise? Am I a Windows, Microsoft fanboy, meaning that all my systems are Microsoft? If you probably see my classes, you probably go, oh yeah, Alex sounds like a Microsoft fanboy. All his subjects are the Microsoft Active Directory type subjects. Or are you a Glenn? You guys know Glenn, right? He hates Microsoft. He loves Linux. Where's your expertise? If your expertise is in Microsoft, then maybe that's what you should choose for your enterprise. Okay, but if your expertise is Linux and all your other servers are Linux, there's no point getting the Windows version, is there? Okay. If you need to, so the other question is, do you need to use it in link mode? So what is link mode? We'll talk about that in a second, but basically one vCenter is fine for most situations, but obviously with anything, if your vCenter fails, what are you gonna do? All those things that we just talked about, the beauty of vCenter goes away, doesn't it? So having more than one vCenter means you have a backup for this critical bit of infrastructure, right? So if you got more than one vCenter, you can set them up as link mode. Okay, that's what the link mode is. Do you need support for IPv6?
So, sorry, so it's not, this feature is disabled for Linux?
So like with the link mode, yes, you have to use the Windows one.
So that's yeah. Really important.
Yeah, that's very important, but it depends on your size as well. And don't forget, it's a virtual application. So even if it fails, you can actually just get a new one very quickly and easily anyway for the Linux one. Okay. So So let's just put it in a simplicity term, okay? If I have large enterprise, it's Windows. If I have small, medium, Linux is okay. All right. But what I'm saying for our class, because of the resources, the amount of memory, the amount of this, the amount of that, we choose a Linux application because we're not here to learn about the thing. We're learning about the interface for the vSphere. That's what we're here to learn about. So it makes no difference after that. Okay. All right. So if we keep on going, vCenter server virtual appliance, Linux runs only as a VM, and that's what we're going to use. And you are constrained to that particular design decision. If you want to use vCenter heartbeat protection, vCenter server from to protect vCenter server from downtime, you'll need to use Windows as well. So really, like I said, when it comes down to it, how big is your enterprise? How much resources do you want to allocate to this?
And how many features you need.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just that, it's how many features you want to pay for. Because there's different versions of vCenter, vSphere, and all those kind of things, like the standard, Enterprise Plus, etc., etc. Okay? So it's a good product, but it's, as in vSphere, it's a good product, but you pay for what you get. You don't always get every feature if you don't pay for every feature. You get what I'm saying? Yeah. So, well, they have to make their money as well, right? Everyone's here to make their money. All right. How much hardware do I need to power a vCenter server? Well, that's a design decision, isn't it? That's probably why it influences us in the classroom. How much hardware resources? Which database should I choose? So at the end of the day, there's at the back end, there's a database, okay, where all our configuration is stored. That database can be Oracle, MySQL, Microsoft SQL Server, many other ones, okay? But which one do I choose? Which one should I use for vCenter? See, these are questions you have to ask for yourself. Again, if I've already got license in Microsoft SQL Server, maybe I'll keep on using that. If I've got license in my company and we already use Oracle database, maybe we keep on using that, wherever the database might be. Should I run the vCenter server as a virtual machine? Even if it's a Windows one, should it be a virtual machine or should it be a physical machine? Okay, if it's a physical machine, then you've got problems with the physical. We all know that if it's installed directly on a physical machine, we can have problems such as the hardware failures. Whereas a virtual machine, we can just actually power up on any free capacity. Okay, sizing the hardware for the vCenter server. Sizing is how much do we need capacity-wise. The amount of hardware a vCenter server requires is directly related to the number of hosts and VMs it will be managing. So how many hosts are we going to have? Are we going to have 5 hosts? Are we going to have 10 hosts? Are we going to have 100 hosts? Okay, are we going to have 1,000 hosts? Because you got to realize that when we're talking about vSphere, we're not talking about the small networks anymore. We're talking about the massive data centers. Okay, this is the type of things you would run in like some of the cloud providers. Okay, so we're talking about large data centers. So basically, the minimum requirement, this is the minimum, and then you go up from there. Okay, you need 64-bit CPU, single or dual core, 2 gigahertz, so 3 gigs of RAM, 3 gigs of free space, network adapter, and if it's Windows, it's one of these versions or later. So VMware suggests, however, a system configured with 2 CPU cores, 4 gigs of RAM to support up to 50 gigs of 50 ESXi servers, and 500 powered on virtual machines. That's quite big already, okay? But trust me, that's not as big as you can get. For environments where you are up to 300 ESX hosts and 3,000 powered on virtual machines, VMware recommends 4 CPU cores, 8 gigs of RAM, and for environments stepping up all the way to 1,000 ESX hosts, 10,000 powered on VMs, 16 gigs of RAM. You're probably going, oh, that's not really that much RAM. No, not really.
14,000.
Yeah, but you've got to understand that the vCenter does not do the virtualization. The vCenter is just a management. Yeah. So if you're powering on 10,000 virtual machines, you must have each ESXi probably has gigs and gigs and gigs of RAM. Okay, so you've got to understand that. So vCenter hardware, the requirements of vCenter do not account for running the database. So that's just for vCenter. The database could be on a different server, could be on the same server. In our instance, it's on the same server. Okay. In reality, if you have a big deployment, it will be on a separate server. If you have a big deployment, you probably have more than one database server as well. Okay. And it's like how long is a piece of string? You might have heard that term. How much money have you got? Because even these database servers can be clustered. Okay. So we can go more and more if we wanted to. So vCenter server uses a database for storing all of its configuration, permissions, statistics, and other data. So there's a backend database, like I mentioned before. vCenter and the database server can be on the same machine, but this is not recommended because it's a single point of failure. Okay, so we all know that. That's probably pretty obvious by now where we're at the diploma. If you have only one of something, it's a single point of failure. We always try to avoid that. And if this diagram, vCenter, lots of ESXi hosts, and a database, and these two are communicating. Again, that's another network, isn't it? That's another network. Or is that the same network as something else? Choosing the right database. Okay, both Windows server-based and both the Windows server-based version and the virtual appliance of vCenter uses a backend database. The vCenter server officially supports the following databases. All of those, I don't want to read out each one, but basically you choose the one that is suitable for your organization. This Server Express is actually a free one. It's a very light one. Did you say light? No, what did you say? Yeah, it's as the name suggests, it's Express. It's actually got a limit. The limit is 4 gigs of RAM. It can be used for this database. So what does that mean? That means if your company grows too big, your database would not be able to support it anymore. So basically, this Express is to get started, good for practice. But if you want to actually keep on growing, grow, you must go to the full SQL server, and that's where this costs money, whereas the Express is free. Get me? So that's how Microsoft gets your money again. Okay, there's always people wanting to make money. So SQL Express Edition is the minimum database available for the Windows server-based version of vCenter, and Microsoft SQL Server Express Edition is a physical limitation. The physical limitation has only one CPU, 4 gigs of 1 gig of RAM, 4 gigs of database maximum. So that means if you're that's very small. That's just to get started. But the good thing is you can switch. So like today you might start with Express, but in the future you realize, oh, it's too big for Express. I can switch to the full one afterwards. Anyway, so but the Express is free. That's the biggest point of all. It's free. Okay. So if it's free, it lets you do all of these things without paying for the license fee for the full Microsoft SQL Server. Large virtual enterprises will quickly outgrow these limits. SQL Express is for smaller deployments with little projection for any growth. Okay, so maybe it's good for the scenario that it's in our assignment, maybe, because our assignment is a fairly small company. Okay. VMware suggests using SQL Express version only for deployments of 5 or fewer hosts, 50 or less VMs. So that's not very big if we talk about comparison to what the numbers we saw before. Choosing the right database. So a selection of the database server to use with vCenter is based on what organization already has license for. Like I said, you got Oracle, keep on using it. You got Microsoft SQL, keep on using it. The hardware requirements for the database is dependent on which one you chose. So it's sort of outside the scope of what we're going to talk about. It's based on what the database wants you have. VMware provides some general guidelines for Microsoft SQL Server. You can look at it in that link if you want to. But really, we're not here to look at the database. We just assume that we're going to have the right database, then we build on top of it. Planning for availability. If you haven't heard of the term availability, I'm sure all of you have, because you're the diploma. Availability means that the service is available. It means we build in redundancies, fault tolerance, and everything that we need to put in, like redundant parts or whatever, to keep the service running. That's what availability is all about. If you have good availability, it means it's not gonna fail in a single point of failure. Okay, so what can we do? Features such as vSphere vMotion, storage vMotion, DRS, and HA, or high availability, stop functioning or is impacted when the vCenter is not available. So all those features that we talked about before, they don't work if there's no vCenter. You won't be able to clone VMs or deploy VMs from templates if the vCenter is not available. You'll lose centralized authentication and role-based administration. Your plan must include and address data loss or corruption in the backend database as well, because that's where all the things are stored. vCenter server heartbeat will automate the process of keeping active and passive vCenter server instances synchronized and the process of failing over from one to another. So have you guys ever heard of the term heartbeat? I mean, not I'm a human being, but by an IT. But like, let's just take a moment to explain that, okay? So if you were a human being and you're walking down Curry Street and you see someone on the ground, you want to help them, right? You want to check if they're alive. The first thing you do is you check if they got a pulse, right? That's your heartbeat. Okay, so when you check someone's pulse, you are determining, are they alive? Okay, if they're alive, great. If they're not, then you got big problems, right? You have to do something drastic. So let's get it back to IT. Instead of having a heartbeat from a real heart, it's just a beacon. I am alive. I am alive. I am alive. Okay, that's just what it's a lot of, this will come up over and over again when we talk about the high availability where it restarts. How does it know when to restart? Because it no longer is getting this heartbeat. So this heartbeat is a network beacon. I am alive. I am alive. And I am sending this to people or to services or to whatever. Obviously, just like if you're checking someone is alive or not, if they have a heartbeat, they're alive. If they don't have a heartbeat, they might be dead. If this beacon stops beaconing and you miss one, it's not a big deal. But if you miss many over time, let's say 30 seconds or a minute, you don't receive any, then you have to do something. Yeah, you have to do something. You gotta now do something. So the vCenter heartbeat. So the vCenter is going, I'm alive, I'm alive, I'm alive, but then it stops. So now the person who's receiving this beacon must do something. All right, so basically what it's talking about is there's an active and passive vCenter. So remember how we talked about multiple vCenters? There's the active and a passive one. The active is the main, the passive is the backup. So the backup is receiving the heartbeat from the active, and if it receives the heartbeat, no problems. Life is happy. But if there's no heartbeat, then this passive one or the backup one must now take over. I must become the active one now. So, but in the meantime, all the things that we're making changes, when it's perfect world, the active and the passive, they're kept in sync because the backend database is being synchronized and so forth. So standby vCenter system that you can turn on the event of failure of the online vCenter server. A variation of this approach could be to keep a standby vCenter server as a VM. So we could do, just one second, let me finish this first. You can keep, with the vCenters, you can have one which is a physical, and one's a virtual to save yourself some hardware, and you can just turn on the virtual if the physical one fails. What's your question?
With the heartbeat, is it using ICP?
TCP/IP, yeah.
Just ping, or
it's not ping, but it's just a packet. It's a proprietary one. It's not an open standard one. Okay. Yeah. So it's the VMware message, if you like to think of it. Okay. So it's not like a part of ping or anything like that. It's just a VMware message in a normal TCP/IP packet. Just sends it.
Okay.
If it doesn't get it, then something's wrong. But if it keeps on getting it, it's just normal traffic. Okay. Except that information is what it is. Okay. Sorry. So we can call this a physical to virtual. Sorry. No, we missed the point there. So you can have one physical, one virtual, and you can create a virtual one from the physical by doing P2V. You might have heard of this term before, converting a physical computer into a virtual machine. Okay, not heard of it before. So with the VMware converter, we can convert a let's say we got a existing server, physical server, and we want to make it into a virtual machine. Sometimes it's you could go, I can reinstall this, reconfigure the services to be just like this physical one. But with the P2V, sometimes we can just cheat a little bit, make it a little bit faster. We take all of this and make it into a virtual machine. We strip away the hardware aspect of it and substitute the virtual hardware into it. So with this process, we can actually regularly back up the physical vCenter. So these are all options, okay? Doesn't mean that we do this is the recommended. These are all options. As a benefit, you reduce the physical amount of hardware, and it leverages. What leverage means is just uses the P2V processor work, keeping two vCenter servers synchronized. As a last resort for recovering vCenter server, it's possible to just reinstall software, point to the existing database, and then when it connects to the database, don't forget the database is where all this configuration is stored anyway. The vCenter server could pick up all that things as well. All right, so if we look at this picture, we could have the main vCenter and a standby one. Okay, we talked about that. But with the database, we could have multiple databases as well. So how do we keep things? There's more and more things we can do, right? So we can configure the databases in the database cluster. If you never heard of the term cluster, it's basically they work together. All right, and yeah, it could be load balance, it could be a failover cluster, it could be all various different types of clusters. You can run a virtual vCenter as a virtual machine. So the vCenter virtual machine, and you can make a copy of the vCenter virtual machine, keep it spare. This gives you several advantages, including snapshots, vMotion, the high availability, and a DRS. If vCenter server is a VM, it's a virtual disk. Its virtual disk can be copied regularly and used as a hard drive for a new VM, effectively providing a point-in-time restore. So I'm sure we're all familiar with the idea. Okay, the idea of taking a snapshot, making a copy of a virtual machine, and we can just do it like that, just as a backup of the critical vCenter. In small environments, the vCenter installer can install and configure all necessary components. For large environments, for example, supporting more than 1,000 ESXi hosts or more than 10,000 VMs, you are required to install multiple vCenters, and they to manage all of these extra hosts and virtual machines, and they work in link mode. Okay, so when multiple instances of vCenters share the same inventory and configuration information for a centralized view of all the virtualized resources across the enterprise, in a link mode environment, a user will see all the vCenter servers instances and perform actions on any ESXi host managed by any of the vCenter servers. vCenter servers linked mode uses Microsoft ADAM to replicate information between the instances. So it's using the Active Directory administrative management to actually replicate the vCenters across to each other. The replicated information includes the connection information, the IP addresses, the ports, the certificate, and thumbprints. So these things are used for obviously trust and security. And licensing information, again, VMware gets their money, okay? And the roles and permissions. Okay, so a link mode group member must be in a domain, must be in the Active Directory domain. The servers can exist in different domains only if there's a two-way trust. This is back to Microsoft Active Directory trust relationships, okay? So if they're in the same domains, everything's easy. Everything's easy because they already trust each other. If they're in two different domains, the domains must first be set up to trust each other with a trust relationship. And DNS must be operational. Also, the DNS name of the server must match the server name. So if you remember from Cert 4, with Active Directory, DNS is super important. No DNS, no Active Directory. You probably heard me say that a million times. The server will run, vCenter server cannot be a domain controller or terminal service. You cannot combine vCenter Server 5 instances in a linked mode with earlier versions or different versions of it, shall we say. Okay, we're obviously using 7 or 8, depending which one you got. We can't mix the versions. Each vCenter server must have its own backend database. So here's an example of what you might see. So in this case, you got vCenter 1, vCenter 2, and you can use the same interface to open up all of it. In here, you got a cluster, and you've got 1, 2, 3 ESXi servers. You've got some resource pools, and in this case, it's a virtual app. And in this other vCenter, you've got only one ESXi. It doesn't look like you've got anything else set up right now. Okay, so I think with the exploring the vCenter, you'll find out more as we're using it. Okay, there's no point me just talking about this stuff. It's very hard to just talk about this stuff. It's when you're using it, you're exploring it yourself, you're using the different parts when we use it, then you sort of work it out. But basically, just in a nutshell, through vCenter we do everything. Okay, once we set it up, we connect the ESXi host in, we use vCenter to do everything. Okay, there's an area for configuring the vCenter services like syslog. There's parts for configuring the security, what's the delegated administration, so where we give other people permissions to do things. There's parts for managing the storage, there's parts for managing the network, so it does everything. So instead of talking about it, when we use it, this is an older version, but when you use it, you'll see that there's areas for doing all sorts of things. Like I said before, roles, we could have licensing. This is where we can, so vCenter, that's the other thing. If you have everything in a vCenter, instead of going to ESXi 1, doing the license, going to ESXi 2, doing the license, you go to vCenter, you put in the license for vCenter, you put in the license for ESXi, and then you allocate a license to all the different resources you want. So let's keep on going. And some of the tasks you'll be doing, including creating VMs, creating resource pools, creating new virtual apps. We'll learn more about that in the future. We can connect, disconnect ESXi's servers, and there's a maintenance mode. That's an interesting one. We'll do that a few times as well. But what maintenance mode is, so if we have an ESXi server, we've got ESXi 1, ESXi 2, and if we want to actually, as the name suggests, do some maintenance, like upgrade the RAM, do whatever, we can actually tell ESXi 1 to enter maintenance mode. But before it enters a maintenance mode, all the virtual machines that's on it must be shut down or must be moved to a different ESXi server. Because when it goes to maintenance mode, it cannot virtualize any servers anymore. So it goes to maintenance mode, and then we do whatever we need to do. We can even just, on the vCenter, restart, reset, do all those kind of things onto the each ESXi server. We can add permissions. We can manage alarms and alerts. We can shut down, reboot, power on ESXi hosts. We can produce reports, and we can remove ESXi servers. Here's some basic host configuration examples. Like I said, it'll be more interesting when you actually do it yourself. So we can schedule tasks as well. So we can use the management features to schedule tasks. The task could be any of these: create VMs, delete VMs, clone VMs, deploy VMs, etc., etc. And this is an example of some of the tasks you could be scheduling. Any of the text highlighted in blue is a hyperlink, and clicking on that text will take you to the object in the vCenter. We can also use this management feature called maps. So it's not clear on here, but if we have storage, if we have virtual switches, if we have hosts, and if we have VMs, how are they interconnected? Okay, of course, you can go to each configuration. You can see, oh, it's using this storage, it's using that switch, it's using that port, it's using that port group. Okay, that's one way to find out. But if you want to visualize it, you can see these lines. This is a virtual machine, for example. This is a storage. It's not very clear, but this might be a host. You can see how they're all connected to each other. The problem, just one second. The problem is, if you want to, let's say, remove a virtual switch, but you have all these things still connected to it, you can't remove it. So one way is to find out what is using it and then make changes. Then we can remove that resource. Alexi?
Can you see that any of these resources are down on this map, or
On this map, I'm not sure. I think on this side, you can see whether they're green or not. This thing next to it.
This is the older version.
Yeah, this is the older version. This slide is a little bit
The
outdated.
new version has it.
But the
if
new
you want? Because it would be really handy, you know.
Yeah.
You see, like,
Oh, definitely. Like you can from not even this one, you can use from other screens. You can see the resources whether they're up or down anyway. Okay.